Well, why am I crawling around on the floor with an electric screwdriver? Stay tuned and I'll tell you more. Hello there and welcome to WB Fine Woodworking. I'm Don Bullock. Over the years, I've looked at numerous designs for different outfeed tables. Some that had tracks in them where you could put jigs. I even saw one that had a flip top so the sander could be stored under the outfeed table and flipped up. Some have very fancy tops on them to make them perfectly flat. I decided I just wanted an outfeed table. I found a design made by Marc of the Wood Whisperer on his website. I decided that that was one that I needed to make, so that's what I did. This is Marc Spagnola's first version of this outfeed table. A few years later, he made another one almost just like it. In the description below, I've left the links to both versions of Marc's outfeed table. Because Marc did such a great job in building his first version, I left some of the details off of my video. You need to check his video for those. After looking over Marc's design, I knew I didn't have plywood for the legs, but I looked up on my lumber rack and saw some red oak that had been sitting up there for many years. I pulled some of the boards down and cut them to width on the table saw. When I ripped the wood down, I made a mistake on the wood for two of the legs. I had to fix that mistake later. The legs for this project are a very simple design. Two pieces are joined together lengthwise with a butt joint. The mistake I made was cutting both boards the same width instead of making one wider. It should have been the width of the two boards that were joined together. To fix this mistake, I decided to add some contrasting trim to make up for the lack of width. Check out my video, Two Ruler Trick, to see how I solved the problem. I set the blade height for the board I wanted to use for the trim. After setting the fence to the right width, I made the rip cut. Yes, the blade guard is off the saw. I do that when making narrow rip cuts, but the riving knife is in place. Since I wanted the screws to go out in even increments from the center of each leg, I set the 0 mark of my longest centering rule on the center of each of the legs. As can be seen here, my ruler was too short. Check out my video, Short Ruler Trick, to see how I solved this problem. I drilled and countersunk the holes. Off camera, I glued and screwed the two pieces of leg together and installed the dowels. As you can see, I was successful with the trick. I now have all the screws put in and dowels to cover them up. Going back and looking at Marc's prototype, you can see that the side rails are narrow and there's a shelf in the middle. For my outfeed table, I decided on a different design. I made the sides much wider and I left the space underneath open so I could build some cabinets to go under there with some drawers. The other deviation I made to Marc's plan was I added an extra piece of plywood on the top. This gave me some overhang around the edges of the outfeed table. The sides and the front and back rails were attached with glue and screws. This is how I decided to attach the side pieces. To find the center of this board, I set the rule on the board and left the same amount of overhang on both ends. Then, using the rule, I'll mark the spacing. I'm marking mine at 5-inch increments. Now I'm ready to drill the holes. The holes are drilled and countersunk. I glued and screwed the sides of the table to the legs. This is what they look like underneath. With the Outfeed table assembled, I installed a leveler to each of the legs. To start off, I used a center punch to mark the holes that I needed to drill. I then drilled the holes. I put a flag of blue tape on my drill bit so that I didn't go through to the other side. With the pilot holes drilled, I used an electric screwdriver to install the 4 screws. I used this screwdriver because it fit in the space better and it has a great magnet that held the screws for me. I used some of the walnut trim that I cut as an edging for the tabletop. The edging was applied off camera. With the Outfeed table assembled and the levelers installed, I applied 3 coats of shellac to the inside and outside of the table. After I applied the shellac, I realized that I didn't cut the slots for the miter gauge. I routed out the miter gauge slots off camera and applied several coats of lacquer to the top. I checked the level of the saw stop and compared it to the top of the Outfeed table. They were pretty dead on, but the Outfeed table was too low. I used my electric screwdriver to level the legs. This is why I was crawling under the table with my screwdriver. I rechecked the level of the saw stop and the Outfeed table. As you can see, it's very, very close. Now the Outfeed table is just below the height of the saw stop. Now to check the miter slots. There's one last test to see if a long board would go across the Outfeed table. This is how the Outfeed table looks in place behind my saw stop. For those of you that have watched Marc's video, you'll notice that I deviated from his plans a little bit. I even made some notes so I could remember where I deviated from his plans. Mine is not as wide as Marc's. I did that because my dust collector is over here and would have been in the way if I'd made a wider table. It's also the same width as the saw stop. I left the bottom area open on my Outfeed table. I explained in the video that I'm planning to put a cabinet under there on casters. By putting the cabinet on casters, I would have access to the dust collection on the back of the saw and the cords that run back there. For the legs, I used 4/4 oak. Now, yes, that sounds kind of extravagant, but I just didn't have any plywood at the time. And over here on my lumber rack, I had some oak that had been sitting there for years. I'd planned to use it on another project and didn't make the project, or I did something else. I trimmed my Outfeed table with walnut. I decided that was a good contrast to the oak, and I had some extra walnut sitting around that I wasn't going to use for something else. I made the sides and back of my Outfeed table wider than Marc did to add some strength because I left the shelf off. I also added a second piece of plywood to the top, very similar to what Marc did in his second version of his Outfeed table. That provided some overhang around the edges of the Outfeed table. And last, I routed the miter slots on mine. You may have noticed that on Mark's first table, he didn't do that. He said that that particular table was low enough and his miter gauge was short enough that he didn't need to route out the miter slots. I decided it was better to do that. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Marc Spagnola. I asked Marc if it was okay to use his photos for my video, and he didn't see any problem with that, and he thanked me for asking. If you want to see a great video showing how to make an Outfeed table just like this, log on to the Wood Whisperer website. Marc has a full video over there of how he made his, and I used pretty much everything that he did on that, made some changes that I mentioned earlier. Now I have to admit, I haven't used mine yet. I haven't had a project where I needed to cut something on the Tablesaw since I made the Outfeed table. I'm sure if there's any adjustments that need to be made, they'll be easier to do because I put some good adjustability, especially into the legs. If you like this video, remember to hit the thumbs up down below and leave any questions or comments that you might have. Please subscribe to our channel, and we thank you very much to all who have. Thank you very much for watching.